joining us. This is the first virtual book launch for Answer Intelligence, Raise Your AQ. So my name is Fiona Allison. I'm the commission editor here in Business Management and Economics books at Emerald Publishing. So today, or this afternoon, the author of Answer Intelligence, Brian Glukowski, will provide a detailed introduction about the book, followed by two shorter presentations from two chapter co-authors of the book, Paul Caranto and Devon Reed. After that, there'll be a Q&A session, so please feel free to put questions into Q&A function, of which I'll be monitoring throughout the session. So a bit of background to the book. I first reached out to Brian in probably September 2019 and to discuss his research and whether he would be interested in turning that research into a book. We had a lot of conversations back and forth for quite some time, and finally in February 2020 we signed the contract. So to now see all of Brian's hard work as well as his co-authors' contributions and their hard work come out to fruition is extremely rewarding for me, and this is actually the best part of my job. I feel we've been on quite a journey together these last 18 months or so. So I'll now pass you over to Dr. Brian. He's Associate Professor of Management at North Central College and founder and CEO of Simpler Science. Over to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Fiona. I appreciate that. So again, just a little housekeeping. This webinar is going to be recorded. All audience members will have microphones and cameras disabled during the webinar. And as Fiona indicated, please at any point hit the toolbar. There's a Q&A button and ask your questions, and Fiona will read these and ask myself and the panelists the questions. Thank you. So today we have a three-part agenda. Spend about 20 minutes on the overview of AQ, and I'll go through that. Second, we'll have a panel discussion with Paul and Devon. And third, we'll have a general Q&A session with all of us together answering questions. So I want to start with this quote. You may not be familiar with this quote. Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian military analyst in the 1830s, and he's credited with the phrase, the fog of war. You can just imagine how terrifying it would be to have bullets flying at you and you can't see those bullets. I think there's a parallel to the fog of war, to the fog of communication. Let me explain. Of course, we can see these questions. We've learned these questions going back to kindergarten, the 6WH questions. But what we can't see is a similar answer typology. We know there's 6 questions, but how many answer types are there? On some level, I think that's terrifying. Imagine you're in your next interview, your next sales pitch, and you do not know the types of answers to provide to have influence with others. So that kept me up at night, and I wanted to do some research on this topic with colleagues. So we decided to search for a framework of answers on the golf course. We interviewed the top golf instructors in the world as rated by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine. So you may say, why golf instructors? And there's really 2 reasons. First, they were experts. We were interviewing those in the upper half of the 99th percentile of their profession. And anytime you interview experts, that's a good thing. Second, there was an interesting aspect of this sample in that the golf instructors taught a wide range of clients. Everyone from touring pros you see on TV to weekend warriors to your young daughter picking up the sticks for the first time. So why is that important? In research speak, there was no restriction of range. So that means if you're communicating in sales, you're going to talk to people that have less knowledge than you, more knowledge than you. They're less motivated, more motivated. And the same is true in other contexts, in meetings and facilitating groups. So if we could understand how these golf instructors provided answers, we thought this would generalize to many different contexts. We published our research in an academic journal, and we came up with a framework that I now call Answer Intelligence. So more than just a list of 6 answers, we identified what we call 5 high IQ practices. Going back to the top golf instructors in the world, there were 5 practices they did that we found is generalized to other contexts. So what I'm going to do is briefly go over these 5 practices for you. High EQ practice 1 is provide 6 answers. So you'll notice the 6 answers. So you have a target, 6 answers to aim at in important conversations. And I should note, you'll see the upward arrow is about 50% full. Mike Sankey, a friend of AQ, retired Dow 30 SVP and CFO, told me that about 50% of the value of AQ is simply knowing there's 6 answers. I point that out because it's pretty simple. Your next conversation, your next interview, your next sales conversation, your next executive coaching session, if you can think of these 6 answers, you have a leg up. And let me go through these 6 answers with you. And I'll do it in the context of interviews. So imagine you're in an interview and you're talking about what a great leader you are. And the interviewer says, what is leadership to you? You should be able to define that concept. You might say, leadership to me is holding people accountable and inspiring people to become their better selves. It's concise, you have command of the material, and you're conveying what leadership is. You could also answer that same question with a metaphor. So you might say, leadership is like a braided rope. 2 pieces of a rope are strong by themselves, but when I do leadership, I do inspiration and I hold people accountable, and I do it at the same time. And like a braided rope, when it's braided, each strand is stronger when they're together. Okay? So that might be a metaphor you could use. Then you start talking about, why should I hire you? This question may come early, come late, but it's explicit or implicit. You got to provide a story that demonstrates your leadership. Okay, we know that. But what you might not appreciate is that in addition to a story, you can answer the why question, why should I hire you, with a theory. And that's cause and effect logic. Sometimes we call theory business strategy in other circles. But after you tell your story, you might punctuate it by describing, when I'm a leader, it leads to team performance. When I'm a leader, it leads to performance. It's that cause and effect logic that you can communicate to others. Additionally, you can answer the how question. When you're on an interview, they want to know, how do you do it? And you can answer the how question with a procedure or an action. So procedures and actions are related but distinct. And I like to think of it like a recipe. When you look at the 10 steps in a recipe, that's a procedure, the steps. Any given step is like an action, such as cracking an egg. So as you're describing your leadership, you could describe your procedure. You might say, when I'm leading others and doing a debrief meeting, I do a plus minus change analysis. I start by asking what was positive. And the second step, I say, give me something minus, something that didn't really work well. I don't know how to fix it. Give me a change comment, something that didn't work well. I know how to fix it. I have a procedure. And by the way, that supports my leadership, because when I ask for something positive, I'm inspiring others. When I'm asking for something that can be changed or something that doesn't work, I'm holding people accountable. And finally, you can provide an action. So high quality actions are best practices or something that is unique. So I might say, with my example of my debriefing of the plus minus change, an action I do is when someone gives a positive comment, I give a negative or change comment. And when someone gives a negative or change comment, I give a positive comment. So that might counterbalance the discussion in the room and keep everything balanced. So that could be an action I use. So these are 6 answers. I'm not saying these are the best answers. I'm a coach, not a player. But when you're providing interview answers, you can provide these 6 answers. Now I move up to High EQ Practice 2, and it builds on High EQ Practice 1. It's answer twice. All the important questions, the why, what, and how questions, you can answer twice to appeal to the left and right side of the brain. Okay, so the left side of the brain is logical, objective, and sequential. It prefers theory, concept, and procedure answers. The right side of the brain is creative, subjective, and random, such as story, metaphor, and action. And it's when you answer twice that you can provide an impact that appeals to both sides of the brain. So imagine in a sales context, that you're asked, why should I hire you? Why should I hire your firm? You might provide a story that's very compelling, and then you might follow up with that theory. You might say, here's a story, our product increases reliability, and explain the theory. If you have increased reliability, that's going to be good for your firm. So you're providing both answers to appeal to both sides of the brain. And it's interesting, if you only provide the story, they may not interpret your theory or strategy the same way you do. So they reinforce each other. So you can do the same thing for the what and how questions. And the trick here is to answer twice for emphasis. You don't always want to answer twice because that could be exhausting. You look for those key questions that you want to make sure the other party understands. Provide compliments is high IQ practice 3. So you see there's 6 adjacent answers. Theory is next to story, story next to metaphor. Providing compliments gets at providing answers that naturally support a main answer. So let me give you an example. So let's imagine we're talking about mentoring. And let's imagine that I'm a senior manager, very experienced with mentoring, and a junior manager comes up to me, is doing mentoring for the first time. And she might ask me, what is mentoring? Not really understanding how mentoring might differ from coaching or just being a manager. So I might start by defining the concept. I might say, mentoring consists of 3 parts. It consists of career support, social support, and role modeling. And I can explain it more, but I'm breaking it down for them in a way they can understand what the concept of mentoring is. Then I could provide a complementary answer, perhaps anticipating that this new mentor might not understand how to provide social support. So I might go on to describe how the new mentor could provide an open door policy and then discuss how that procedure would be implemented. So the point is, when you provide complementary answers, it answers the main question, in this case, what is something, and provides a complementary answer how to do it. And they reinforce each other. So that's a good technique you can use when you're answering questions. Then we get to high IQ practice 4, which is answer with style. So each individual has a different style. I have a different style. Paul and Devin have different styles in respect to the type of answers we prefer. So I prefer analytical answers in the yellow. Second, relational and practical, third. To the point in the classroom, at times I didn't even have a textbook, no practical answers at all. But each of us has our strengths and our weaknesses. Imagine this in the context of leadership AQ. You're a newly promoted leader. And if your style is very strong on relational, perhaps you're not providing the analytical or practical answers you need to provide because your team needs all the answers. So you have to be aware of your style, your strengths and your weaknesses, but also you have to read the room, understand the style of others. If others prefer relational style, provide those kind of answers. If you're on a sales call and there's senior executives that are very focused on analytical style, business strategy, you better provide those kind of answers. So answer with style is also very important. And finally, the last high IQ practice we identified in our research is answer in context. So all the answers, theory, story, metaphor, action, procedure, and concept have to reflect the context, when and where. So imagine you're doing a training. If you're a trainer, if your audience is senior executives, you might choose one type of story. If your audience is junior individuals, you might choose a different kind of story. In the sales context, if you're providing a case study to a client and it's a pharmaceutical client, the case study better be about a pharma company, right? We all understand context matters. And the last question, just to point this out, is who? And I don't neglect this question, but who needs to provide the questions? Who needs to provide the answers? That's also reflected in our framework. Who needs to have elevated questions? Who needs to have elevated answers? So this is also included in our framework. And I want to just provide one example of when I realized AQ was an important framework, at least to me. And I'm trying to make the pitch to everyone here that AQ is a framework you should look at as well. So, at one point the framework wasn't established. I couldn't see the whole circle, and I was just experimenting with different aspects of the framework. So let me set this up for you. I was working on a project with myself, a CEO, and a business partner. And we all needed to work together on this project. So I wanted to try out a metaphor on the CEO, and I thought of a metaphor. And basically I said, we have this project. It's like a three-legged stool. We have to work together. If one of us don't work together, on the stool is going to come out and we're all going to fall down. And I just sort of put it out there. I was quiet. And frankly, I was biting my lip because I was a little concerned that sounded a little bit sophomoric or amateur hour at the Apollo or something like that. Anyways, I found out it worked. How did I know the metaphor worked? About a week later, the CEO, unprompted in a meeting, brought it up and brought up the metaphor of the three-legged stool. So wow, it worked. And I came to reflect upon it. And my conclusion was it worked because of what I later referred to as complementary answers. In particular, there was a form of complementary answers I think was under display called the strong form of complementary answers. I think the CEO responded well to the metaphor because, to be frank, I provided a great story for why we needed to work together, a business strategy or theory, explain the key concepts, the procedures and actions of how we're going to do this were all spelled out. So all the answers supported each other. So that's why the metaphor worked. So for me, this was an initial touchstone story that got me thinking about AQ and trying to use it in my own life. And before we get to the panel discussion, I want to come full circle in this part to discuss our favorite Prussian military analyst. He talked about how do you fix the fog of war? You have to have skilled intelligence. And in AQ terms, when we think of the fog of communication, it's answer intelligence. This is a framework about answers that's going to help us see the answers you need to navigate your next conversation. But it's also a framework about questions. No science of answers can exist without including questions. And this builds to the equation that communication is questions and answers. So you're going to look at this and say, yeah, that's obvious. But what I really mean by this is that communication is only questions and answers. Everything else is noise. Everything else is a smokescreen. If you focus on questions and answers, this is what you need to be effective in communication. So I'm going to go that far. And I think that's the promise and potential of AQ as a framework to help us simplify and understand communication. And the last point I want to make to move beyond the military metaphor is that I do believe AQ works in adversarial conversations, but the spirit of the book is to use AQ for collaborative conversations. It is to have maximum impact with others that want to engage in productive communication. So I hope that comes through when you read the book. So that's an overview of AQ. So hopefully we can contextualize this and have some fun with this in our panel discussion now. So I'm going to move forward, Fiona, unless you have a question right now. Would you want me to move forward?
There actually has been a couple of questions, but they've actually come through on the chat directly to me rather than on the Q&A panel, which is fine. The chat is maybe more familiar to some people. So one of the questions is actually, what is the best way to implement this? So if you're managing a sales team, do you bring this in as a team, or do you start as an individual and try to spread sort of the practice throughout your team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, probably multiple answers. One, you could start by reading the book, and if you're interested in it, then it can be spread with others. We have, some short assessments we can take where someone could take it. But I think at its core, it's pretty simple. I'll give you one simple exercise you could do if you wanted to use this. Take your most important conversation and prepare for it. So let's take sales. If your most important conversation is sales, what is your value proposition? Think of one aspect of it, and can you provide 6 answers related to your value proposition? If it's reliability, if it's flexibility, if it's innovation, can you provide all 6 answers? Discuss as a group, and then in your next sales conversation, try to provide those answers. And I think if you do that, you'll feel like you made progress and were successful, and you can go on to some of the other practices.
Okay, thank you. And there was one more which you almost was touching on then, which is asking that this sort of using this framework sounds like it could be time consuming. It might work quite well in an interview, but what if you're trying to do an elevator pitch?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this framework is actually pretty light in the sense that a lot of frameworks that are out there, you have a lot of moving parts. I'm a yellow unicorn, or I'm a red dolphin. You have to learn this secret language. This framework is questions and answers. We know all of this. And second, I think it's actually very effective for something like an elevator pitch. You often think of an elevator pitch as a story, but what if you're in the elevator and the person's already convinced with the story? The elevator pitch may not be answering the question about why, it might be answering the how question. So it's really taking a more solo approach to how we communicate and what are the most important questions to answer.
All right, thank you, Brian.
Fiona, would
Yeah.
you, I don't know how Devin feels, but I wouldn't mind giving a little comment relative to those questions as well from a perspective of where I see it.
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, probably will tie into some of our conversation, Brian. And I want to thank both of you for including myself and Boston Mutual in this session, as well as the book. I've had the good fortune of working with Brian for a long time and seeing this develop. I think as far as implementation is concerned, I really think this is very much a commitment holistically on the part of the organization to think differently about how they're going to approach their business. I mean, it really takes it from a very tactical sort of siloed approach to a much higher level strategic understanding that there isn't any conversation or decision we make today that's independent of others. It's everything impacts everything else, and the ability to be incredibly thoughtful in arriving at the right decision, seeing the intended and unintended consequences are very, very important. So I think to implement this in the middle of an organization as a practice in and of itself would miss the mark. I think it's really buying into starting at the highest levels of the organization and leading by example and demonstrating that that's the way we're going to go about thinking about things that we do. Not whether it's sales, whether it's brand, whether it's strategy, whatever it is. I think there's a better way of thinking. And to your point about really, it's question and answer is communication, Brian. I think what this says is today we live in a world where everybody has questions and wants answers right away. What this framework does is to help us, maybe in a communicative way, say, we're not going to give you the answer today. We're going to be more thoughtful about the question and really apply all of the techniques that are here in the AQ approach to arrive at what is the best answer, because answers are hard right now, and to give the wrong answer doesn't gain anybody anything. So I think there's a bigger picture here. I think that it's attitudinal and strategic. I know in our industry we've been very, very tactical, very expert oriented. We know what we know. We decide. We move on, we react. This is about transforming the way we think to be proactive, holistic, understand that there's interdependencies to everything we think about. And that's why I love this framework and all we do. So sorry if I went too long.
Thanks, Paul.
I don't know, Devin, if you want to jump in, or I can move on to Paul.
Sure. I agree with Paul, and especially the concept of, this is, if you're going to roll this out, you have to do it from the top. And this is everybody all hands on deck, just like you roll out a new pitch deck, a new sales methodology. This is part of that. And the reason I personally really enjoyed it is because right now, and I come from the B2B tech world where I know it's a little, more progressive than some of the other, trends, but understanding the buyer is a trend that is really picking up steam right now. It's less about the message you want to convey and more about the message you're hearing from your audience and your market. And this framework plays into that beautifully, because it's not just about the questions that you ask as a seller, which we can get into later. Everyone's been trained on these things. It's how can you better understand and give better questions, or better answers.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Let me push forward here a little bit, if that's okay, with our panelists and Fiona.
Yeah.
Before I move on to discussion with Paul and Devin, I just want to briefly acknowledge all of our co-authors listed here in a wide range of topics. Thank you. And of course, today we have Paul and Devin with us and already sharing some of their insights. So I'm going to continue on with that. So I want to talk about brand AQ, and before I start with some of the first questions here, Paul, I just want to continue on what you said and make a couple comments about brand AQ. just make one brief one. I think when you think of brands, you think of stories. And if you Google brand and story and brand and metaphor and all these different variables, brand and story combined has 12 million plus hits. Everything else is very small, less than 50,000 for the most part. So I think, to Boston Mutual's credit, they took a much broader view of what a brand is. A brand is not just a story, it's having a sound theory, in their case, what a family is, and it's having procedures and actions to implement important concepts, and having metaphors, and having all these tools to communicate effectively. So want to just set that up briefly. And I've had the good fortune of witnessing Boston Mutual's authentic brand and how they communicate so well. And I think they use this framework to further amplify what was already strong. So with that being said, Paul, I'd like to ask you a first question. If you want to, sidestep that question and make some remarks as well, that's fine. But my first question to you is, what is the relationship between Brand AQ and Boston Mutual's "Family Matters No Matter What" slogan?
Well, Brian, thank you again. I would say, it's interesting. I do think to a large degree, our brand, Family Matters No Matter What, is a result of the AQ approach we took to evolving our brand. I've been fortunate enough to be with this 130-year-old life insurance company for 30 years, and 8 years ago was fortunate enough to be chosen to lead the company, and only the 7th person in that leadership role. And one of the things that I thought about, you have your time and the company has a need as you sort of settle into that leadership role. And what would my role be? My predecessor had some financial issues to get cleaned up, and he did a fabulous job. And now I took a company that was in a pretty good place, but my charge was to grow it and really to think about how we could do that in a way that really played to our strengths. And I always felt with my roles in the company up to that point that there was something very special and unique about the way we did business with the people who sold for us and bought from us and ultimately that we served. And I thought we needed to give voice to that brand. And that was the journey we began on. And you helped us in creating internal committees to help us identify what that was. It was clearly this feeling of family, but I mean, everybody says family, right? So it was the research and ultimately the science that we deployed through this process that we're looking at today, that you're publishing a book about, that I think led us to a place where we understood what is important from a family standpoint. In our case, it had to do with our ability to be flexible, our ability to be cohesive, our ability to communicate, that we put science to that. And Dave Mitchell, one of the co-authors, who still runs really a brand session for any new employee that joins the company, takes people through that process, takes through what the meaning of that is and how we see that impacting the way we treat each other, our customers, all of our stakeholders, in terms of how that is. And that is very important. And Devin gets this from a sales standpoint. If you're just like everybody else and you're on a spreadsheet, you lose. If you're not creating some value, our value is who we are. It's that family matters no matter what. And it's incredibly important. And what I find really interesting, as I thought about today, is, the research you did went back to the Great Depression and really what it was that made families strong and why families were so important for people to get through that time. And I find it very ironic that here we are a year after we've been living through a pandemic, if you will, that has really driven people back to understanding how important family is and the aspects of family that help us get through tough times like we're getting through right now. And so I think, to a large extent, it has been our brand, who we are, because it's real. It's just not a check the box. When you were helping us go to market to find a PR firm to help put the ultimate final voice to this, I think the highest compliment we had was one of the easiest jobs they ever had, because the brand was real. They had too many people come and say, "I'd like you to make me this." And then when it came to Boston Mutual, it was, "You are this. We just need to figure out how to put voice to it." And it served us incredibly well. So I see them as one of the same. And I think it was really a springboard for us to apply this approach, this AQ approach, to everything we did, from strategy through all of the decisions we make in the organization. And my hope is that if we do that and do that well, and I think we get better at it every day, that we will do what I had hoped we could do when I took over, was to stimulate this level of growth and really let more people know about the goodness of a company that does some pretty neat stuff.
That's great, Paul. And I wonder if I could just echo back some of the things you said, because I think they're worth emphasizing. You pointed out that in our framework, the theory of Boston Mutual's brand was three components: cohesiveness, flexibility, and ability to communicate. And as you pointed out, that research went back to the Great Depression. Families that survived the Great Depression were strong at those three attributes that led to goal achievement. So that's not a trivial thing to hang your hat on a theory like that, because a lot of the other insurance carriers out there, I did the research, they say they're a family, but it's sort of a vacuous term. So what you have here is a theory, a business strategy that you have tied directly to the different aspects of your organization. So you're talking about customer support. The key concepts are flexibility, cohesiveness, and communicate well. And how do we implement that in terms of procedures and actions? So I've seen that, firsthand, witnessing what you've done, and it's been quite remarkable.
Well, thanks, Brian. It does apply to everything. In our world, we're faced with so many emerging issues. It's how we want to treat our people, how we want to create the right workforce, and in the spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're looking across the environmental, societal governance framework these days. The way we go about thinking through all of these issues are no different. The way we want to be perceived in the marketplace, it's the same way. Being able to take ourselves through the exercise that you explained on the front end of this webinar, if we can do that, then I feel like we're in a good place with the action we're taking, whether it's specific to brand, our people, our process technology decisions, whether it's our community engagement, whether it's the way we treat our customers. That this sort of thinking embeds the organization, and I hope more so every day. But it has to be top down. It has to be me driving it into the organization, the leadership team driving it into the organization, to be that thoughtful to get to the best decisions we can come to in a time where that's a challenge right now. The world's moving pretty fast.
Yeah, that's true. Great points. I wonder if I could ask one more question, then Fiona, perhaps there's a question from the audience after that.
There is actually, yeah.
There is. Okay, great. And I'll ask one question. I'm curious, from your vantage point as a CEO, and we've talked about brand AQ, interview AQ, sales AQ. What kind of conversations do you think this framework might lend itself well to, or what kind of development from an employee standpoint do you think it could lend itself well to?
Again, I think I touched on it a second ago, Brian. I really don't think there's any aspect of an organization's work that this sort of thoughtful approach doesn't apply to today. So, but again, I don't think you just say, hey, this is great, hand the book to your head of HR and say, make this work with our people, or I think it needs to start at the the leadership team level, to say, are we doing this? Again, I think your charge as executive leaders of an organization is to, define what leadership is, create that followership, create that strategy, but you've got to make sure that that's a thoughtful approach. The world is moving fast. We're getting, changing winds every day. You need to be thoughtful and nimble, and the whole process needs to incorporate that level of thinking in arriving at your decisions, so that you can anchor yourselves with some degree of confidence that you're moving in the right direction, and not having to, geez, we should have thought a little bit more about that, or we looked at this strictly from this aspect, not that aspect. I just think that I don't think there's any aspect of what we do today where we don't, maybe not specifically deploy the wheel here, but I think our discussions certainly entertain everything that is included within the profile.
Perfect. Fiona, why don't you ask the question?
There's actually two now. So the first one is, how does theory and strategy in brackets differ from action?
I can maybe, you want to take that, Paul, or would you like me? Either way is fine.
Why don't you preamble, and I'll give you my perspective on it.
Okay.
But if you want to start, go ahead.
Sure, I'll start. So all these answers are related but distinct. So the theory is more abstract. So for example, I could have a theory that leadership leads to performance. So the theory is broad, it's abstract. The action is specific, and the action is going to vary depending on the context. So for example, using military, since we had a military reference earlier today, historically, in a military context, the action is that the leader leads from the front, because in military context, particularly going back, 1800s and earlier, who gets shot? The people in the front. So you lead from the front. But we know in sort of modern business, we often talk about leading from the back, right? The leader empowers others with their actions. So the point is, a theory or strategy is something that's abstract, that's going to apply everywhere, but actions are unique and they're going to vary depending on the context.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the answer I would give, Brian. I mean, I think your best actions are done in coordinated with your strategy. So I'm a big top-down person in how I believe. I think good strategy will lead to good decisions, will lead to good action that will ultimately produce the results that you're looking for. Misguided actions don't get you anywhere except burning a lot of energy and missing out. Opportunity costs are out the window. So I look at this in the wheel, and your theory, your story, and both half the brains, right? But it almost trickles down as well. You start at the strategy level, you build it out a little bit, and then you get to action, and that's the way I see it working. At least that's the way we try to deploy.
Yeah, I wonder if I could give another example, maybe bring Devin into this. So the example is, I did a workshop with a sales organization, and they had executives who were asking why questions. And they were really looking for business strategy answers. And these junior salespersons didn't understand the question being asked. And what do they respond? Respond with how answers, procedures and actions, features and functions of a software product. And the executives were completely turned off because the executives wanted a theoretical answer. They wanted the big picture. And then these sales reps are going into actions. So even though theory and action, all these answers are related, they're different questions that require different answers. So I don't know if you have a response to that, Devin, but there's my my dipping my toe in the sales space.
You're in the right waters for sure. I wrote some notes down. It's funny, I wrote some notes down before I really went through the deck, because I wanted to kind of test myself and see if how aligned I was the way I interpreted the information. And I agree completely. And one of the things I had in my notes was, in my experience, again, in technology, all the companies I've worked for, except for one, were new technologies, a new way to go about a problem. And when you're introducing this, it's, called an educational sale. So when someone has never seen, for example, Gong, and we do AI for sales, I won't pitch you, but we do AI for sales. If I go right into the procedure or the action of how that works, it goes, I would say, over their head, maybe under their feet, because it doesn't even go over their head. They don't even, it doesn't even reach them. And the thing they always ask is, well, why would I use this? Why do other people use this? They want to understand the reasoning of what's broken for you to tell me I need this solution. And that's that abstract thing, right, in this theory. And I can give you examples if you'd like. And what I found successful was the origin story from our CEO, which is his story of why, what was happening, why something was broken, what he tried to do to fix it, and then ultimately his epiphany of this is the solution that we must do. Once that starts to resonate, then you can get into the what, and then the how makes sense. Okay, well, how are you doing? That's when I knew the story worked, when people would follow up with, well, how does that work? Okay, great. Now that I'm in the ballpark with you, let me walk you through not even the technology yet, but just the, the components that go into, rolling something like this out, and some of the benefits the leadership team will see.
A great response. Maybe Fiona, you want to follow up with the second question for Paul?
Yeah, to be honest, the second question actually ties quite into the first one.
Okay.
So it says actions are often a logical sequence of steps. Is there a reason why it is classified on the creative side of the framework?
Actions? Yeah. Because actions are more of a gestalt. And I'll put it in sales terms. Take CRM. CRM's a procedure. And if I can be really sort of stereotypical, a lot of sales reps don't like to go in the CRM and log all kind of stuff in the procedures. They just want to go sell and do the actions. So there's really two ways of understanding how to do something. You can proceduralize it. You can take something and make many, many steps and explain it in very much detail, Or you can say there are no steps, I'm just going to go sell. And it's the art of selling. So the actions are always the art side. If you want to turn the art into science, so to speak, you proceduralize it. And the two sort of work together. But that's sort of my best answer for that. Hopefully that hits the mark.
I would only add to that, Brian, quickly that, I think it sort of validates that most of us are wired to go tactical before strategic, right? So, and I know, especially in our world, an expert world in the insurance industry, we immediately go to our strengths, our expert area, we take control. I think opening our mind to understand that, these things it's not always square peg, square hole on all of this, that, some of these things cross some lines, if you will. It's not always easy, but I think you described it beautifully. But I think the bigger picture is, let's get ourselves some strategy. Let's be thoughtful. Let's map out how we want to make it happen, and let's make it happen is the framework that this is intended to help with.
I'll just add to that, and then maybe we'll pivot to Devin. I really think knowing the 6 answers. I like to think of this framework as simple but not simplistic. We're all familiar with these answers, but have we always had them in focus during our conversations? Sort of an illustrated point. I'll allow work with students, and they'll say they have a number 1 competency, leadership, negotiations, etc. But then I'll follow up and say, well, what's a metaphor for that? They have no idea. They might have a story. If I say, give me a procedure that explains your number 1 soft skill. If you say you're a great leader, then have you thought about it, and do you have steps you use in different situations? If you can't answer it in terms of procedure, have you really thought about it? Are you really trying to master your craft? And I think at some level, once you're exposed to this framework, if you don't try to master all the answers, I think there's a deficiency in what you're doing. I mean, that may be a little strong, but I would go that far. So why don't we move on to the next portion? We'll bring Paul back in as we brought Devin in. And
there's no more questions. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. I apologize. Instead of brand AQ, it should say sales AQ. I guess there was a procedural flaw there. I had my steps. I didn't follow my checklist properly. So we're talking about sales AQ. And I think, what I'd like to do, Devin, is sort of jump right into you. If you could maybe give a little overview of your company and what you do, because I think that's germane. And I will say, with this chapter, we took a look at Gong and your artificial intelligence overlay in sales calls, and looked at some of your research and examined it through the AQ lens to look at it in terms of questions and answers that could be improved upon throughout the sales process. So if you could, maybe just a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, of course. In prepping of this, I was thinking of our conversation, and I think it happened in 2019 because I was back in my office, like my HQ at Gong, and I've had thousands of conversations since then, as all of us have. I remember exactly where I was, what I was looking at, what we were talking about. Like, it was a very impactful conversation to me, and I'll share why in a moment. But about Gong, what we are is a revenue intelligence platform. What that really means is that we automatically capture all of the different sales interactions that happen between buyers and sellers, specifically, the emails, phone conversations, and web conferencing, much like Zoom. And what we do is we provide insights at scale to help sales leaders understand what's working and what isn't in their sales strategy. So that can be as kind of granular as how often, when Devin was selling to Paul, how often was Devin talking versus listening? And we have some high level stats that will show you what success and failure typically look like, all the way down to a larger level, like, hey, your entire enterprise team needs 5 contacts or more to close deals because there's data showing that when you have less than that, you fail, and many, many, many insights in between. So at a high level, that is what we do.
Well, that's great. I could start with a question. I'm really curious, particularly in sales, a lot has been written about question-based sales methods. Why is it important to have an answer-based approach that we're suggesting here with AQ? Is that necessary Why might that be important? What's your perspective on that?
So to go back to why I remember that conversation was when we were talking, I've been a sales rep for 6 years or so. I've done many sales trainings, as in, received sales trainings. I'm one of those people who have written about sales questions and the ones you should ask and why. Never once had anyone taught me, or even in passing mentioned, the way you answer questions is important. And so I was really amazed at this, in hindsight, somewhat obvious. Like, how could I not see the other side of a coin? Of course. But the reason why is because a few things. So I'll try to be concise as possible. And I feel answering one of your questions is like, answering a question, an answer guru here. Like, I'm looking at my table, hoping I hit the right marks here. My first thoughts were, I have my strengths in the way I answer questions, and my strengths are story, metaphor, and procedure. And so I thought, well, those are my strengths. I should stick to them. But there's clearly another side, and it's the analytical side. So as a seller, I've typically sold to sales and marketing professionals who are storytellers, who, metaphors resonate with them really well. So it probably makes sense my strength either was always there or, nurtured it in that direction. There could be other people like me who are selling to developers or to people in the IT industry, and they might be struggling and not knowing why. And it's because most of their questions they're answering are stories and metaphors, but their buyers, in fact, would resonate more with theory and concept. The other one was the example you shared, Brian, which is, why do so many sellers, I want to say junior sellers, but it's not always junior sellers, struggle to resonate with executives like Paul? It's because Paul's looking for theory and strategy, and I'm over here pitching you process and action. And so the first step was like this aha moment of awareness that, wow, there's so much more out there. I can, and like you've talked about, I can learn it, and I can be significantly more successful, and I will be more successful because I'm better understanding, like I mentioned earlier, my audience.
That's great. What I'd like to ask you about now is the chapter we wrote, and it was really a fun collaboration, looking at the Gong data, looking at your sales expertise, along with our other co-author, James Kakis, looking at AQ, combining it together. I wonder if you could share with us maybe one or two insights when we sort of combined the Gong data with the AQ framework. What were some aspects of the chapter, maybe one or two, that you can share with us you thought was interesting to a sales audience?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of them. I think the one that I found interesting, and it gets a little meta maybe perhaps, but one of the things we looked at when we do our analysis, and to put a little bit of context behind it, I mentioned, we would help, one individual sales team, they use the software. What I also do in my current role is we anonymize all of our product users' information, and we do analysis at this. So it's a very, a big data analysis. And one of the research posts that we did was take top performers, people that were consistently over 110% to quota, and another bucket, which were, I believe, 80 to 100%. So your average performers doing well, but never making the president's club, so to speak. And we looked at objections and how they handle objections. Now, objections, of course, can be a question, but it could also be, I'm not interested, a statement that kind of blocks you. What was really fascinating was that top performers will respond to an objection with another question 54% of the time, versus average performers only do it 31% of the time.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I think this is really interesting is a lot of salespeople will hear an objection or hear a question and respond very quickly. It's like a reactive response, instead of really being aware and taking, forgive the pun, a responsive approach to the response, which is really understanding, where is this coming from and why? And so by asking what we call a clarifying question, responding to this objection with a question, what you can do is get to the root of the concern before presenting a solution or an answer. And so I think that's kind of as close as, in terms of getting kind of overlap with what your framework is, which is, again, it's really important to get to the root understanding so you have a clear path of communication.
I think that's a great point. And I just want to respond to that. We had, part of this in our chapter, and then another chapter, as I've already alluded to, this is a communication framework of questions and answers. And as we start to really open this up, we can really think about this. So as a seller and buyer, 2x2 matrix, the seller can ask a question and answer, the buyer can ask a question and answer. So you can respond to a question with a question and answer with an answer. And it's about thinking strategically through this. So like, for example, Devin, imagine if the buyer provides a great story. So as a seller, I could say, wow, I get it. That was great. Imagine if I provided a metaphor that paraphrased that same concept, that's going to convey to the buyer that I really got it. So for example, I don't have a sales example ready, but we know the story of Romeo and Juliet, right? The metaphor is star-crossed lovers. So imagine in real time, you take a story, you provide a metaphor, and it just communicates very economically that I get it. But other times, ask a question, provide a question, provide an answer, and it really helps you think through, navigating that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think, Paul, I'm sure your sales team has this training, everyone's trained on objection handling, top 10 objections that you're going to hear at this company and how to overcome them. And I just mean at your company, Paul, I'm sure just in general in your career, you've heard this. How often do people also train, here are the top 10 questions you're going to hear, and here are the best ways to answer them. And that's something that worked really well. It's funny, again, we are salespeople selling sales software to salespeople. So there's, that red plot couldn't be more up my alley. But we would have in our Slack, our internal communications on the sales team, hey, I just tried this story. Hey, I just tried this metaphor and it worked. Here's what it was. And a common one was, like I mentioned, no one had seen talk time aggregates. No one had seen statistics of what to talk about and what not to talk about. So we would show this dashboard on the demo. Of course, there was the temptation to get into the procedure and the how this all operates. But the question we got wasn't really an objection. It was, what am I supposed to do with this? What is all this?
Yeah.
And the best metaphor that someone on the team came up with was, right now you have a compass. And it will, for the most part, if you know how to use it well, get you to where you need to go, but it'll take you a little bit of time. And maybe you get there, maybe you get lost. Gong is like the high-tech GPS. You punch in where you want to go, it's going to tell you how to get there and as quickly as possible and with absolute certainty. Yeah. And we would listen, of course, we could listen to these calls. So you hear this rep pitching it to this person and you would hear them go, oh, okay, got it. Now I'm like on the same page and it makes complete sense. So what happened? Everyone's talking about GPS. Gong is a GPS now on these calls, but only for that very specific part of the demo when that very specific question happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so much more to it though, right, Devin? I mean, that's your whole point, is that can lead you there, but there's things you need to do to deploy that GPS system,
right,
using this whole framework so that you can engage in that Q&A session with that potential buyer. If you haven't been thoughtful enough to ask yourself all of the questions, to be prepared with all the answers to play right or left side of your brain, then you are just a commodity out there that's just using a GPS system and showing up and maybe getting there faster, but no more successful. So that's, I think this thing is so holistic. And that to me is, whether you're a salesperson, whether you're executive, whatever it is you're doing, I think, this thing gives you that holistic approach that gives you the opportunity to deploy whatever it is you need to do to be that right person in that right situation.
Exactly. And what was fun too is when we started getting bigger, analytical buyers started introducing to the sales process. So people were trying this metaphor and this red approach to analytical thinkers, and we were hitting a brick wall. And we had to reassess, hey, why is the same question and the same answer not working with this individual? Well, this individual is in dashboards and sales operations, and they're thinking about it much differently. So we had to find new stories, metaphors, or in this case, concepts and theories, which of course at the time we did not know this framework existed.
Yeah, it's a great example there of context. The different buyers matter.
Yeah.
You probably want to move us on to the maybe one or two final questions, and then
I was just going to give you a 5-minute warning, but yeah, you knew what I was doing. You know what, I actually had a question myself, but Devin sort of answered it, because I feel like I'm quite like Devin in that I am a very story and metaphor focused person, and that's my style. That's the way I approach things. That's the way I approach, interviews or discussions. And, as commission editor, sometimes I have to do a lot of pitching, basically internally and externally. So, but Devin sort of already answered, like the sort of the process to getting better on those other, doing the actions, the procedures, the theory, and the concept, and not just the story and metaphor. So that actually answered my own personal question. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course.
Fiona, do we have any more questions from the audience you'd like to ask? I certainly have some questions I could ask our panelists before we adjourn.
No, that was all the questions. Thank you. And you all did a lovely job of answering them, as it has been actually said in the chat.
I wonder, there's
So,
a I wonder if I could just ask one last question for Paul and Devin, and then you can make some final comments, Fiona. I'm just curious, to keep this practical. So if someone wanted to use AQ in their next meeting, what advice would you give them if they were thinking about trying to up their answer game, so to speak? How would you coach them? What might you suggest they do or try? So maybe, I don't know, who wants to start there? Who wants it, Paul or Devin?
Go ahead, Paul. I just talked. It's your turn.
No, that's good. I don't want to rain on your parade, but one of my thoughts is first of all, I'll put a plug in for the book right now. I intend to get our executive team as well as our board of directors a copy of the book. So I think that's helpful. I think sometimes though, Brian, when I think about things like this, if you come in and really just present it very academically, I think people shut down a little bit. So I try to, I think having the book to fall back on is one thing, but I think a more, I'm a storyteller too, so I'm in the red buckets, but I think to begin to try to explain what it is we're trying to accomplish. And in our case, it's been a mantra of mine for a while. It's a sort of strategic, holistic thinking that I think you need to talk about that. Are we approaching our conversations the right way? Are we challenging ourselves with the right questions? Are we coming up with the right answers? Are those answers that we're giving us the results that we expect them to get? And at what rate of efficiency are we getting there? I think those are sort of the things that when you ask yourself, say, is there a better way? And this framework gives you that better way. It leads you to much more a thoughtful approach that should be a lot more efficient, a lot more effective in terms of how you identify what the questions you need to answer, when you should answer them, how you answer them, and then how you adjust as you move forward. So I think it's got to be a little bit of both. I mean, you and I have had that conversation for a long time, the business world versus the academic world. And I just think that I think some practicality to it in terms of getting your leadership team on board and challenging them that maybe there's a better way than we're doing today would be a good start.
That's a great answer, sort of practical and thoughtful nudging. That's sort of how I paraphrase that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you. Devin, a thought on that, and then we'll move to Fiona's final comments.
Sure. I will say, do it the way I did it. Of course. No, but I did it by simply, I think recording your calls is great. Now I've been using Gong, so I'm used to recording calls, but honestly, even if you use Zoom, if you can record yourself, I think that's very helpful. But even if you can't, in your next meeting, think of the answers that you naturally give. Don't try to filter yourself. Just give the ones you're already giving, and also listen to the answers if you're in a group setting, what other answers are people giving? And try to think, are they resonating or not? And those questions, someone goes on a 3-minute rant and you get a follow-up question where it's kind of like, what do you mean, right? Like, try to just get aware of what you're doing, and two, what's working and what is not. And you'll start to get a feel, like Fiona said, what is my style? Where can I improve? And I think from there, definitely pick up the book and start getting more context so you can start getting a little bit deeper other than the awareness phase.
Also, great comments. It reminds me, I sort of did something similar with the framework, the awareness, just being aware matters so much. So I remember like listening and thinking to myself, oh, there's Joe, the story machine. There he goes again, and I was thinking, wow, he could definitely provide some different answers perhaps. That's great advice. So let's turn it over to Fiona. And before I do, I just want to say I just want to say personally, thank you for everyone involved with this book again, and thank you especially for Paul and Devin for being part of this event today. Fiona, would you like to take it home?
Yeah. So, as a added incentive, not like you needed one to join this webinar, we have you can win a copy of a free signed book and also win a free 1 hour consultation with Dr. G. So we're going to just use a random number generator after this session, and we'll follow up with the winners of both of those. Excuse me. Also, we are offering 30% off the book with the code on the screen, which is answer 30. This code will be active from the 14th of April, which is the official print publication date of the book. So, not that you want to, oh, sorry, you missed out on the by pre-ordering there on the discount, but don't worry. Yeah, so if you want to wait till then to get the book, then you can have 30% off as well. Just as a thank you for joining this session. We really appreciate it.